Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, also known as JSSJ. If you're passionate about justice, equity, and inclusion, and you're looking for a distinctly Jewish lens, USF's graduate-level JSSJ certificate program offers a powerful opportunity to grow your impact and deepen your practice. This fall, dive into Arab Jews, Histories, Politics, and Identity with Hadar Cohen. Explore the complex and vital identity of Arab Jews and what it means to understand them as an integral part of the broader Jewish world. Applications are open now through August 15th. Learn more and apply at usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 495, Israel-Palestine, Conversations Across Generations. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today is the first time in the history of the Judaism Unbound podcast that we are talking with a mother-daughter duo. Our guests today, Amy Eilberg and Penina Eilberg-Schwartz, recently published a series of letters entitled The Distance We Have to Travel, snapshot of an intergenerational Jewish conversation after October 7th. They published it on Ayin Press's website, and the piece shares letters that they write back and forth to one another on the topic of Israel-Palestine in the shadow of October 7th and its aftermath. So many of us of all ages have been struggling with these conversations about Israel-Palestine at work, in our social circles, and with close friends. These conversations are often most difficult and painful when they happen in our families, often across generations. When we read these beautiful letters, which are full of both profound disagreement and also deep and abiding love, we had a sense that understanding how our guests were able to do that might offer all of us some teachings on how we might better navigate these kinds of conversations in our own lives. Before we get into it, Lex, can you share some Judaism Unbound announcements for this week?
I absolutely can. We have a couple pieces of info that you'll all really be interested in hearing about. First, our Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning is back. We've got 3-week mini courses in the UnYeshiva that will begin very soon. You can sign up for them because registration has just opened over at judaismunbound.com/classes. We have 4 amazing options this time around. We've got Anti-Fascist Mussar, Jewish Radical Ethics with Reuven McCullough, the Sidur Unbound, Make Your Prayer Book Your Own with Robin Banerjee, Elul, Your On-Ramp into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with Wendy Bernstein-Lash, and we have Comix Midrash, Drawing the Pardes of Elul with Rina Yehuda Newman. You can learn more about all of those by heading to judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid, as always, is available via a quick form that you can access on any of the registration pages. We hope that you will check out these amazing options. All of them are designed, partially or fully, for the purpose of prepping you for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the month of Elul. So we hope that you will dive into those. Relatedly, we have Elul Unbound, our on-ramp Halamonth initiative, where we take this beautiful month Elul as sort of one big holiday, one big Halamonth, and we take it as a moment to explore where we want to grow as individuals, as communities, and as a world. And you can sign up for Elul Unbound by heading to judaismunbound.com/ELUL. So that's a couple things that are arriving soon on Yeshiva mini courses and Elul Unbound.
Thanks, Lex. So let's talk about loving conversations. Our first guest today, Amy Eilberg, is the first woman ever ordained as a conservative rabbi by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. She serves as a spiritual director, peace and justice educator, and teacher of Mussar, a Jewish system of spiritual and character development that we've explored in previous episodes on this show. Amy Eilberg currently serves as chair of the Racial Justice Subcommittee of the conservative movement's Social Justice Commission. In 2014, she authored a book called From Enemy to Friend, Jewish Wisdom and the Pursuit of Peace, in which she blends ancient Jewish sacred texts on peace building, real-life descriptions of conflict engagement, and contemporary conflict theory. Our second guest, Penina Eilberg-Schwartz, is a returning guest. She was our guest on episode 355 when we talked to her and her colleagues about their work at Ayin Press. Penina Eilberg-Schwartz is a writer and editor who has organized in Jewish communities around peace and justice in Israel-Palestine for over a decade. She is the author of In This Place Together, A Palestinian's Journey to Collective Liberation, which tells the story of Palestinian activist Suleiman Khatib, and she is also the author of Everything in the Speaking of It, a collection of essays and prose poems. Penina Eilberg-Sc is the managing editor of Ayin Press. Amy Eilberg, welcome to Judaism Unbound, and Penina Eilberg-Sc, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
So we did a series of episodes a little while ago talking about American Jewish discourse, about what's going on in Israel-Palestine, and it occurred to me when I saw the letters that you published that we hadn't really done an episode, I think in part because we didn't really know who to interview, to talk about what for many of us, I think, is the most difficult element of the American Jewish discourse on Israel-Palestine, which is the discourse in our own families. There are so many relationships that have been broken by the inability to, I don't know what exactly, to do what needs to be done, to be able to have loving disagreement, machloket l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the sake of heaven. What does that look like? Some of that stuff sounds really good when you read it in the Talmud, but when you actually are hit by a situation, a lot of it seems to go out the window. And I was just so impressed. We were so impressed when we read your letters that, wow, this is not that. This is doing it the way that we wish it would be done. I wanted to start just by understanding, I guess, both how your correspondence began, but also what was there before the correspondence began. You started the correspondence, or at least what's published here, I think about 6 months after October 7th. So I'm wondering what was happening during those 6 months, as well as how you started the correspondence and email.
Okay. Ema's pointing at me. Well, my mother and I have been having a conversation about Israel-Palestine definitely since I left for college and sort of had my political education, re-education moment of feeling really shocked by what I was learning about the history of Israel-Palestine, about the history of the Nakba in 1948, what Israelis call the War of Independence, and also even just sort of more broadly reflecting back on my Jewish education growing up. I, went to Ramah. I was Camp Ramah in Ojai. I was in USY. I went to Jewish day school up until middle school. And I was really reflecting on the Holocaust education that I had received, especially in college, was like, wait, there were all these genocides that were occurring in the 90s when I was sitting on the carpet in my Jewish day school being traumatized by stories of the gas chambers. Why didn't anybody tell me about Rwanda or Bosnia? Like, why this tunnel vision on Jewish victimhood and suffering when there was all of this reality of suffering around me? So anyway, at that time, I started to have a lot of questions about that enculturation, about Zionism. And my mom and I started having really, really difficult conversations, I think, particularly around Zionism. We've been having these conversations for however many years now, since 2004. And so once October 7th happened, we had a lot of practice. And in terms of what was happening in those 6 months between October 7th and when we started to write the letters, like so many others, I was just in so much shock and pain and activation. I was doing direct organizing. I was trying to think with my colleagues at Ayin Press about what contribution we could offer. And I was also really trying to think about how to use my voice in a way that would, in some small, minuscule way, contribute something helpful. And at the same time, I was on the phone with my mom often, like way more than we usually speak, talking about what she was feeling, because by the time that October 7th happened, my mom had already shifted considerably politically since we first started speaking in 2004. And I was actually honestly surprised that she was not immediately ready to call for a ceasefire. So we were having these conversations where I was mostly just listening to her. I don't know, I don't think I was trying to change her mind. I was telling her what I felt. And I was really, really hoping that she would come out publicly for a ceasefire, because I wanted to be on the same side. And I also recognize that she has rightfully a lot of respect in many Jewish communities. And I wanted her voice to be out there saying this killing has to stop. And then after that, once she did sign a letter, I was just in my process of trying to figure out what I wanted to contribute. It was actually a conversation that I had with Sarah Ann Minkin, who wrote the foreword that kind of inspired me. I don't remember what she said, but something she said helped me come up with this idea to reach out to my mom and see if she would like to write letters. And I think honestly, at first, I was hoping that her sharing her process of not being ready to call for a ceasefire and then coming out publicly in service of a ceasefire would sort of help people who read the letters, who were still sort of feeling the things that she was feeling at the beginning, kind of move with her. Because of course, the things that Ima was feeling at the beginning, all of the grief about the Israelis killed on October 7th, about the hostages still in Gaza, of course, she was still feeling that as I was. I was hoping the letters could provide a model for sort of bringing those feelings along and then move towards opposition to Israel's actions in Gaza. I don't think that's exactly what the letters did. I think they did something else, and we can talk about that, but I'll pause there and see how Ima describes the lead up.
Yeah, I remember that after October 7th, we talked a lot more than usual. We were both in a lot of pain, and I really wanted to support you in your pain, even though it was clear that we weren't in the same place, even though I was, very much opposed to the Netanyahu government, right down the line. But in my response to October 7th, I felt renewed Jewish trauma in myself and felt responsibility to be in solidarity with friends in Israel, with Israeli Jews in general, with Jews in the community in which I live who were just in profound pain about having been attacked, that we were attacked in this way. Even for those of us in the US Jewish community, it felt we were attacked. I was very much leaning into listening to other people's grief and shock and horror, almost the kind of grief counselor part of me, not to make it artificial, but that's kind of a part of me that was coming forward, of really wanting to listen to everybody. And every time I bumped into an Israeli at synagogue or at a shiva house or at, whatever randomly, how are your loved ones? How are your people in Israel? Reaching out to my friends in Israel, assuming they'd be devastated, which they were. I was really in listening mode, especially to Jewish pain during those early months. And I was also, of course, deeply engaged, Penina, with your pain. I wanted to hear. And in a way, early on, I started to feel comforted by our conversations with one another, that even though we were in different places, and you were definitely not making it clear that you were trying to change my mind. That's because your listening practice is so good. I felt like you were really listening to me too. And you were, obviously. So in those early months, I was really, really into listening mostly to Jewish pain. And as the months went by, for me, it was my privilege in a way as a Jew who doesn't live in Israel. I didn't have a child in the army. I didn't lose people directly, on October 7th. So the sense of trauma receded just a little bit for me so that I could think. I was really not in thinking mode in the first couple of months. I was really just in, kind of traumatic grief. But then as the months went by, my thinking capacity came online again, and it gradually became clearer and clearer that what the Israeli government was doing was indefensible. I didn't say it as strongly as that. I only gradually became able to say it that strongly. Then I think I was even more actively listening to hear how this will look for her, really trying to learn. And then when the campus protests began, the Jewish community was newly traumatized. And it felt traumatic to me just because of the nature of the conversation in the Jewish newspaper, on the Jewish street, all of that, as if the war had come to where we lived also, because of the claim or the feeling they're attacking us on college campuses and the arguments and counter arguments about that. There was war raging at home, but when Penina and I were on the phone, even though we weren't in exactly the same place, we were practicing peace. And that was a comfort because it was very clear that we were practicing loving listening and communication across difference.
Yeah, and that really comes through in the letters. Even just looking at them kind of casually, most of yours, Amy, start, "Dear Sweetie," and I think most of yours, Penina, end with, "I love you," and I believe it. It's not just a kind of casual, love Penina, it's "I love you." I'm interested in both the question of how those of us who actually love one another, meaning parents and children or friends, I mean, Lex and I have had difficult conversations, how we make sure that that love is not lost when we disagree. And what it took from you, you talked about peaceful, loving conversation. Like, what did that look like for you in that loving relationship? And we could talk about it later, but I'm then curious about how we might learn from that to have conversations with those that we don't love in the same way. Even if we might say, oh, we love all Jews or we love Israel or whatever. And I actually don't like to use that language so much because I think it's mostly fake. But that said, it would be nice, and I think it's really important to figure out how to love those with whom we don't have that kind of intimate relationship, and how to talk to one another with the lens of that same kind of love that might come a little bit easier for us when we're talking to people that we do have intimate relationships with.
Yeah, I could jump in with that. It's funny, as you're talking, I'm thinking when it's family, when it's someone that you really do deeply love, the practice of deep, compassionate listening across difference is both harder and easier. It's harder because, well, in our case, Penina came home from college and I remember we were sitting in the car in the midst of a sort of shopping trip, and she was unpacking the whole, what does it mean that a nation has a right to exist? And I'm sort of exploding inside, like, how could it be that, this daughter of mine is saying these things? So it can be really, really painful. And in a way, staying in touch with how much we love each other is really not hard at all. It's really easy, except for the reactivity that arises. I mean, it's conceptually easy to understand how, my whole, amygdala got strangled when I went into, fight in those times, a little bit fight mode. I don't know if we actually did flight mode, but mostly fight or freeze. I guess I was a little bit less in touch with the deep love. So it's the reactivity. And I think vast swaths of the American Jewish community are in that kind of reactivity around subjects of Israel and anti-Semitism most of the time. I want to say that compassionately because it's a traumatic reaction, not even post-traumatic. It's a really traumatic reaction. And I think the Jewish community has done a lousy job in trying to heal our trauma. We've rather accentuated our trauma, over time. So we keep reactivating each other over and over again. And when something really horrible, somebody, commits a horrible shooting in a synagogue, and then comes October 7th, then, the activation goes off the roof. So conceptually, it's about activation. And the other thing, and this is why it was a lot easier for Penina and me, not without moments of challenge, I guess, but really, I would say it wasn't hard to be in conversation. Now, it was 20 years ago, is because we both have very deeply and intentionally honed listening practice.
Yeah. Well, thanks to both of you for sharing these letters publicly and for this conversation. I'd love to get into some particular moments, some pieces that I found really moving in this series of letters. One of them was sort of a hint to a prequel. Like we didn't see your conversations in the first 6 months, but there's a moment where you're talking specifically about language choices. And we should say directly, like a lot of these letters, it's not that there's one core theme, but I do think the question of how we mobilize, and if we mobilize, like stark, intensified language in the conversation around Israel-Palestine is really a core theme. These are letters, which are, verbal forms of communication. It's funny, they're not really verbal, like they're written, but they're about how we exchange verbally as well. And there's a moment where we learn that the phrase mass death and destruction has been a phrase that you've discussed before. Penina, you sort of articulated that for you, the word genocide does feel appropriate for this situation. Amy, for you, the term doesn't. It led to actually both of you feeling like, oh, there's this phrase that isn't the word genocide, but that is pretty intense, mass death and destruction, that you both felt comfortable with. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. We don't have to go into like why one thinks this is genocide or not. Although if that's something that either of you is called to, I'm not, like, this is not saying you're not allowed. But that feels really instructive to me because for me, like, I'll put my own cards on the table with like dialogue situations. For me, a conversation where people listen deeply, I don't want to sound like I dismiss that, but I worry about the tendency we have, whether it's an interfaith dialogue or Israel-Palestine dialogue or other, like, to presume that it's sort of an end as opposed to a means to an end, for us to have a good conversation where we feel heard. That matters, and it certainly matters for family members. I don't want people's nuclear family or other close relationships to be torn apart. But for me, actually landing on, oh, I found a phrase, like, that's what is magical about this in a way that goes beyond just you heard one another. So I'd love to hear, what was some of that? We're not gonna, like, I don't love the word genocide, but mass death and destruction is actually a common ground for us.
Yeah, I mean, I would amend how you set up the question a little bit. I mean, I had been using this term mass death and destruction when talking to Ima on the phone. I had also been using the word genocide. She knew when we started the letters that I believed that Israel's actions were genocidal, and that I also, perhaps even more importantly, wanted to defend the people who were using the language of genocide from attacks and also just, reactive responses that Jews were having to that word, such that the word genocide was treated as an act of violence that somehow superseded the actual bombs that Israel has been sending down to Gaza and the tens of thousands of Palestinians killed and all of the things that we know. But mass death and destruction for me is something I was still using, not instead of genocide, but partly strategically when I wanted to soften what I was saying or find a way to enter the conversation that was a little bit less pointed. So mass death and destruction is something that I was using in conversations with Ima in that way, also in conversations in other Jewish spaces where I wasn't ready to use the word genocide for various reasons, not internally, but just because of dynamics where I was like, that will explode this conversation and I want to be able to stay in the conversation and push in other ways. But in the letters, I say, when my mom says, yes, I can agree on mass death and destruction, I push back and I say, I don't think mass death and destruction is a place that we can rest easily because it seems to sort of remove an actor. There is no sort of clear responsibility within mass death and destruction. I think I say it sounds like the act of an unkind God. On the one hand, for both Ima and myself, we're interested in having these conversations. We want to find ways to actually be able to stay in them. And there are times for me where I choose not to use the word genocide with a Jewish person who would not listen to me if I used that word. And in those cases, I will sometimes use mass death and destruction. But there is a risk to that. And the risk is minimizing Israel's responsibility for its actions after October 7th, for all of the destruction that it continues to cause, all the death and starvation and everything that is just continues to get worse. So yeah, I don't think that we landed on mass death and destruction. For me, it was a point of sort of showing the problems of this act of conversation. And Lex, I totally agree with what you say. I think one of the reasons for me that it took me a long time to be willing to publish the letters is precisely what you raised, this concern that by engaging in the act of conversation publicly, I didn't want to suggest that conversation was an end in itself. I was engaged in direct organizing. I believe all sorts of strategies are needed, including protest and financial pressure and many things. And I really, really believe in conversations that hold a multiplicity of viewpoints and registers. But there is, I think, particularly in the Jewish community, a danger of sort of engaging in this way. Because, yeah, I don't want to say that this is an end in itself. It's absolutely not. It's one strategy that I believe can be supportive of other modes of social justice organizing, but it doesn't save lives, and we need to be saving lives. Another fear that I had about the project is that it would seem that we were prescribing a way of speaking. I mean, on one level, I did come to understand that one of the main goals for the project was to offer a model for how to have these conversations. And at the same time, perhaps in some kind of irresolvable contradiction, I did not want to be prescribing that people need to be speaking in the way that we're speaking. And actually, one of the arguments that I'm making in the letters is, and this is another area of disagreement between Ima and myself, is that we need to be cultivating, especially in Jewish communities, resilience to speech that's more direct, that's sharp, that's angry, especially when those are things that will inevitably be instigated by acts of mass killing or genocide. And so, part of my project in the letters was to try to figure out how to encourage Jews who are having these really reactive responses to patterns of speech like those in the student protest to not treat those words like acts of violence, although there is a conversation to be had about language and violence that we could come back to, but to not treat them like acts of violence that supersede the actual violence that Israel is wreaking in Gaza, and to not allow the words to become a whole world that then makes it impossible for one to connect with Palestinian suffering. While I do want this to be of service as a model, I'm also really wanting to be clear that, Jewish communities in particular need to be able to have space for conversations that don't look like this. And that's part of the work too.
So I really am appreciating both of your reflections. And Amy, you said something a little earlier that I would love to visit, not from a place of attack, but from a place of genuine interest and clarification. You were talking about how in the early days of after October 7th, you said that you were listening mostly to Jewish pain. And I'm really interested in that phrasing. Part of what I'm asking is what you mean by Jewish pain. I don't feel like I sort of self-evidently know that. I'm not assuming that you mean a particular set of things. One struggle that I have, partially related to like my own and for all of us, our social networks. Like there's a lot of Jews in my life, and almost all of them have absolutely felt deep pain since October 7th. But the directionality of that pain and what's provoking it is like deeply not consistent. And I think we could have like entire fascinating deep studies of what different Jewish pains are manifesting and for what different kinds of people. But like in my day-to-day life in Providence, Rhode Island, and the Jews I know and interact with, the more common, I'm not saying this is more common universally, just like my day-to-day experience is like the Jewish pain I most encountered was pain over feeling misrepresented by Jewish institutions and pain at the loss of both Palestinian and Jewish life, as opposed to a kind of Jewish pain that is like pain at the loss of Jews, like pain through the angle of devastation to the Jewish community or to Jewish populations, in the way you were talking about, like feeling we have been attacked, we the Jewish, even those of us who aren't in Israel. I'm interested in opening that up because I actually sense that you probably don't disagree with that there are these different kinds of Jewish pain. But I'd love to hear more about what you mean, because so many of us in positions of like Jewish professional work or other ways that we might talk sort of as Jews, we have to figure out what we mean by that. And the most common articulation of sort of Jewish pain is in contradistinction to Palestinian pain. It implies sort of a pain at a loss of Jewish lives. And I'm not sure that that's really what Jewish pain most accurately is today. So I'd love to hear, Amy, what your thoughts are on that phrase.
I really appreciate the question. I really appreciate the way you're opening it up, because I think of myself as someone who has spent so much time, so much really sort of deep living and learning time beyond the centrist, Jewish community, that I often speak language that people in my synagogue don't even understand what I mean. But in this case, when I said Jewish pain, I meant it in that sort of a centrist Jewish, we were attacked, and then people are attacking us on campus, and there is this kind of rhetorical violence. And I did experience it that way. We'll come back to that. So when I said Jewish pain there, especially in the early months after October 7th, and there's something generational here too. I'm older than you, right? I'm a boomer. So my relationship with Israel has been said many times, was nurtured in a time when Israel was David and not Goliath and all of that. So although I've deconstructed that, very much in my own thinking, that still lives in me. So after October 7th, my attention was completely drawn to Jews in Israel, friends, colleagues, people that I care about who had either knew people who'd been killed, knew people who'd been taken hostage, had children or friends' children who were in Gaza and were terrified for their safety and all of that. So that's what I meant about pain done to Jews by non-Jews. So maybe that's to say my reaction to the immediate trauma of October 7th was to narrow my attention, as is normal. When you're sick, you tend to pay more attention to, what hurts than to what other people are needing. That would probably happen again. If something similar happened, I also thought it was my pastoral responsibility to really pay deep attention. I'm not had I been on a college campus, I might have been listening to other kinds of pain, but in the circles in which I walk, everyone was reeling from the attack. Later, partly because Israel's tactics became less and less defensible, because things, began to be clear. I really, really believed at first that there was a component of Israel's response that was just understandable retaliatory attack that any nation state would engage in. And yeah, it's truly terrible that people are killed. Innocent people are killed, but what could Israel do? I mean, it sounds a little ridiculous to hear myself say that now, but in those early months, I felt that way. I think now, even people Jews in my generation, bracketing Israelis, it seems to me that at least a primary pain among Jews now is shame and horror. Terrible things were done to us on October 7th, but then gradually beginning to open up and to see and what because Israel is still we to me in some very painful and ambivalent way. What Israel was doing was just horrific and immoral and un-Jewish and indefensible. So to be carrying around this we with reference to the government, even saying over and over again to anyone who'd listen, I'm completely against the Netanyahu government and I support all the organizations that try to end his government, and all of that gradually turned to shame. So yeah, you sort of caught me in a kind of ethnocentric reflection about Jewish pain, and that was part of my reaction, as many people's reactions. But yeah, I had that sort of retreat into the family early on in the immediate wake of the attack.
I was really struck by the way that my mom was understanding her responsibility to listen to what she called Jewish pain in that time. And I think that in some way was part of the lead up to the letters. I mean, I was watching this in many people, Israelis in my life, and also American Jews from, multiple layers of distance. People were sort of reliving October 7th, including like today, people are still reliving it as if nothing has happened since that day. And it was really feeling to me, and still feels like many people in the Jewish community are haunted. Like there is this sort of something is inhabiting our bodies in a way that messes up how we understand time, like where there has been no present since October 7th for some people, which is part of why they can't engage with the horrific amount of suffering that Palestinians are experiencing. And I've been thinking about this sort of hauntedness a lot and sort of what can be done about it. And this is actually one of the reasons why I really believe in this project of the letters, because I don't want to leave anybody behind. As much as I believe in protest and all of the direct strategies, they have a hard edge, and they are for something other than bringing people along who are haunted. The strategies that can sort of give people a path out of that singular mode of identification, that singular pain. The strategies that can help with that are art and care and conversation and having access to a multiplicity of voices that maybe also echo the actual multiplicity within the self. And so the sort of alchemical work of conversation, my hope is that it gives people a path to sort of exercise ghosts, to like feel a sense that there's a way to get somewhere else beyond this moment that can hold their grief about Israelis who have lost so much on October 7th and since, and at the same time hold the just completely unimaginable amount of suffering that Israel has caused and is causing Palestinians. And that's my hope, that that sort of work can live alongside all of the other direct strategies that are essential for trying to bring the actual violence to a halt as soon as possible.
We've now had a couple of conversations with interviewers and on our own since the publication of the letters. And we've been reflecting about whether either or both of us changed as a result of this writing process. One friend who's very sophisticated in his view of Israel-Palestine surprised me by saying one day, I read the letters, they were really beautiful and moving. And it struck me that you changed your mind and Penina didn't. In one sense, that was true, that I did, partly because of listening to Penina for sure, and partly because Israel's actions got more and more horrific and extreme and indefensible. And, situation also changed, that I changed my mind about how I understood Israel's attacks on Gaza. And I didn't expect Penina to change as a result of the dialogue. That's not my philosophy of dialogue. It's not that its goal is to change people. In that sense, gets back to the conversation we were having before about whether dialogue is a means or an end. Theologically, actually, I think dialogue is valuable in and of itself. I think it's sacred in and of itself. It's meeting the other, the divine in the other, and the fully human in the other. So in that sense, dialogue is sacred and beautiful and valuable in and of itself, no matter what it leads to. But in the context of gross injustice, it's very certainly a means. And my position was, and really still is, that when people use the word genocide, I'm now less offended by the word genocide now that I've sort of seen 50,000 plus dead and so many Israeli leaders seriously talking about ethnic cleansing, really moving 1 million or 2 million Gazans and resettling, God help us, right? And still, when Penina kept raising the question, how are we going to get where we want to go? I still believe that when you yell at people, they tend to not hear you. That's a philosophy of relationship for me, and a philosophy of dialogue, and a core commitment for me as a dialogue facilitator. When you yell at people and shame and blame, they tend to harden and tighten, and they don't grow and they don't open. In one sense, I think it's wrong to use that, very, very harsh language at people when it's used as epithet. It's thrown at people almost, in a weaponized sort of way. And I really agree with Penina when she says, Jews who have more of a traditional mind do need to develop more resilience. How we get there is a question in order to be able to tolerate language that's difficult. And I hear you now today, Penina, saying, you're sort of appreciating maybe a little bit more the way in which loving listening or gentle listening is a strategy, one of the strategies. And that's needed. Maybe you would have said that at the beginning of the process too, but it sounds maybe a little bit clearer. And I think it's clear to me too that dialogue is not the only thing I do. I also sign letters. I also go to demonstrations. I don't feel like there's anything I can do that's remotely enough, but I, donate to organizations that are making a difference on the ground. So we agree that dialogue is not enough.
One thing that Penina, I take exception to a few things that you said, which maybe we talk about, but the one that I really take exception to is where you said that this kind of dialogue doesn't save lives. I think it does. And I think it's really important to note that it does. I think that there can be, and I'm not suggesting that you have this, but I feel like I've experienced this from folks farther to the left than me and often younger than me, a kind of self-righteousness that says that the way that we're going to save people is we're going to yell and scream and protest and something is going to happen. Like you were just saying, Amy, I think that often what happens is that people become hardened, and that actually does endanger lives. And, I am a chassid of Stephen Covey, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the things that he talks about is that with people, slow is fast and fast is slow. That often the fastest you can get people to move is slow. And that can be really hard. And it can feel like that we can't move slow because people are dying. And of course, that's true and that's right. And yet, if slow is the fastest that people can possibly move, slow is better than slower. And the question is, how are we sure that the way that we're talking to one another, the way that we're trying to move the world in the way that I think all of us in this Zoom room agree that it should be moved, I think what we really disagree about probably is how to move that in that direction. I have found that to be a really difficult place to be living over the last 2 years. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I don't like people using legal terminology incorrectly. Genocide is a crime. It requires mens rea, which is an intent. Now, some people will say that that intent is collectively there. I don't know that it's been proven. I think the word genocide was used very early on in this situation, before all the numbers that we're now talking about. So there was a concern perhaps that there should be a genocide. Actually, that's what I think the International Criminal Court said. There was a concern that there could be a genocide. But I think that it's hard to take seriously the people who are saying that it was from day one. And that, I think, has hardened a lot of people and has made them not open to the conversation. Now, so as a lawyer, that offends me, but as a Jew, it's also hard to hear. Now, it might be true. I don't think it is, but it might be. And if it is, then, I ought to hear it, right? And by the way, that's why I think it's so important that we do what we do on Judaism Unbound, and that you did what you did in your letters, is that I think we have to listen to each other. And I love so much that you talked about that you're both committed to a listening practice. Lex and I are also committed to a listening practice. And I think sometimes a lot of folks don't understand that. And they say, why are you platforming people that have these views that I find offensive? And I'm like, we're talking to them, and you should talk to them too. So the concern that I have, though, sometimes that I feel like I get from, again, those farther to the left than me, is that this is all about strategy. Penina, you talked about that, like that they have a strategy that may or may not convince me to, come along in their direction. But we're all human beings. And if the nature of our relationship is that they're strategizing about how to get me to come in their direction, and there's no openness to coming along in my direction, that's kind of hard. And Amy, some of your words about the sort of lishma, for its own sake, the sacredness of conversation, is saying, like, can we talk about this, that we're human beings and we probably, none of us has the whole truth? And the only way that we're going to discover that is to be in truly loving conversation with others who disagree with us, in the same way that anybody who is upset that we're talking to people who say that it's a genocide, the only way that we're ever going to change one another, the only way that we're ever going to get somewhere that is worth getting to, is if we're able to continue to be in loving conversation with one another. And that's what I'm trying to sort of find the language for, and particularly to talk to, not with the people who agree with me, but with the people who disagree with me, so that we can sort of try to tease out, well, what are we actually trying to do here? And one thing that we're trying to do for sure is save lives. And so there's a question about effectiveness. What is the most effective thing that we can do in order to save the maximum number of lives? I would like to explore that question because I think it's really important, probably the most important thing. And also, we want to do that in a way that is befitting of our highest aspirations as human beings and as Jews, right? There is an ethics that says, what are we allowed to do in order to sort of serve that higher purpose?
Oh my God, there's so much that I want to say in response to that. Mostly I want to talk about the saving lives piece, but I do just want to address the genocide piece briefly. And I think I mostly won't say much about that because I think you can read the letters if you want to know the argument I was making. But I have compassion for people who are not using the word. I want to say I don't feel like you're bad for not using the word. And at the same time today, I still really feel it's an appropriate word. I mean, especially, I know when this airs, some time will have passed, but there has been a total, as of today, several months of a total humanitarian siege. Nothing getting in. I don't know how that can't count as intent. So I won't go too far into it, but I just wanted to signal that, like, I totally hear you. And like, for me today, it just only keeps getting clearer that there is intent. And I agree with you about the saving lives piece. I mean, what I meant to say by dialogue doesn't save lives is that it doesn't save Palestinian lives that are being lost right now, like on an immediate sense. Like, dialogue is not enough to save Palestinian lives right now. We need, I mean, I really don't know what the right organizing response is right now, to be totally honest, but I do think that we need to be trying all the direct things, the protests, the financial pressure. And like you said, dialogue is slow, and it should be slow, and that's not bad. It just means that it's not enough. But I agree with you that the work of conversation is the work of creating the world that we want, which is a world where mass killing does not happen and where everybody has self-determination and freedom. I completely agree with that. I just think we don't have to choose. Let's do all of it at once and recognize that all of it is needed. I think I actually talked about this on a podcast many years ago after I wrote a book with Suleiman Khatib, who is one of the Palestinian co-founders of Combatants for Peace. There's this story that I heard on Being many years ago now. Krista Tippett was talking to a former white nationalist, and he is now a white anti-racist organizer. And he was on the podcast with an Orthodox Jew who was a close friend of his. And they had this incredible story that the former white nationalist, when they were at college together, had been outed as a white nationalist, and people were outside yelling at him and throwing stuff at his window and, saying all the things you can imagine. And this Orthodox Jew invited him for Shabbat dinner. And of course, he was a white nationalist. He was an anti-Semite. But he started going to Shabbat dinner, and it was partially through that relationship that he transformed and understood the sort of horrific nature of his former beliefs and became an anti-racist organizer. And Krista Tippett said to them, wow, this is such an incredible testament to the power of dialogue and friendship. And the former white nationalist said, yes, it is, but also I'm not sure if I would have accepted the invitation if it weren't for the people outside yelling. There was like a point of desperation for him that allowed him to do something that he wouldn't have done otherwise. And for me, that's a really powerful example of the ways that we just don't understand how these different strategies relate to one another, honestly. I think another really important piece of this sort of conversational work for me is this piece of imagination, which I think comes into the letters a little bit at the end. In times like this of such catastrophic suffering, it's really easy to sort of lose contact with a visionary future, with what we want the world to look like. And it's actually even more important now that we maintain contact with that, both imagining what a just, peaceful future would look like in Israel-Palestine that would serve Palestinians and Israelis alike. And also, Dan, like you're alluding to, what our conversations in Jewish communities feel like, that don't collapse into polarity, that hold multiplicity and argument for the sake of heaven. I actually learned something about the relationship between imagination and conversation when I was working on this book with Suleiman, because I was watching him over years talk to Jews who would usually not listen to Palestinians, people who were very resistant to Palestinian narratives. And I would watch them change their minds when he spoke. It took me a while to try to understand what was happening, like what made this possible. And I think a part of it was that he was articulating and elsewhere, he was describing a shared future that the people he was speaking to could see themselves in and wanted to live in. And so that's a piece that certainly, the patterns of speech that we see at the protests or even the use of the word genocide perhaps doesn't do that. But I do think that this work that Ima and I were doing together in the letters that I'm still very committed to alongside all of the other strategies has that capacity to give people who are haunted, who are reliving October 7th, who feel like all that's happened in history is October 7th and the Holocaust, to hold that pain and then to not get stuck in that time scale, to see that there is somewhere else that they can live that, that holds them and also serves Palestinian freedom and the well-being of all people.
I don't know the answer, but I do know that there are ways of thinking about social change and peacemaking that are grounded in love. But it also, from what I know, what limited knowledge that I have of the protests, at least what I see on the surface of the people that the news media covers, it doesn't necessarily look like it's a theory of social change based in love. I mean, I'm very, very interested in nonviolent theories of social change, in Gandhi, in Martin Luther King. Those ways of thinking, and Gandhi and King are just the most obvious examples, need to be really elevated more. And I mean that as a commentary both on the Palestinian solidarity protesters and on Jews who claim to be fighting anti-Semitism, but are fighting it with hate. How effective is that, to fight hate with hate? So I think that reminds me that, with all our talk about strategy, but also Penina encouraging us to think also about imagination, I'm also thinking about spiritual practice. Sometimes there are things that we desperately want to see happen in the world, and we actually don't have the power to make it happen. I desperately want for the US administration to be utterly changed today. I don't have the power, certainly not as one person and not even on the immediate level in solidarity with others, to make that change happen. So emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence in these situations includes qualities of humility and powerlessness. That doesn't mean don't do anything. It doesn't mean don't step up and engage in the protest and the action and the writing and the giving, in the relationship building, all of that may help. But to the extent that it's unbearable, not only because people are being harmed, but because I can't get what I want, that's a spiritual flaw that all of us would do well to examine for the sake of our humanity and for the sake of the effectiveness of our activism.
Thank you both so much, Penina Eilberg-Schwartz and Amy Eilberg, for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Thank you so much. So good to be here.
Thank you. Really wonderful to be with you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, we have 3-week mini courses in the UnYeshiva, in our Digital Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning, that are kicking off soon. Registration has just opened. You can learn more by heading to JudaismUnbound.com/classes. As always, we want to make sure that nobody experiences finances as a barrier to taking our classes. So if you do need financial aid, you can fill out a quick form that's available at any of the registration pages. So don't let that get in your way. Head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes. Also, as we close, we hope that you will be in touch with us. If you have thoughts about today's episode, any of our other recent episodes, our work more broadly, always feel free to send us a note. You can be in touch in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other goodies. And you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We're also deeply appreciative to anyone out there who's able to support our work financially, which you can do on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift by heading to JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.